All right, I think we're recording. All right, so welcome everyone. Again, thank you all for participating, even though the meeting notice was a little bit messed up this month. Sorry about that. We'll try to do better, but you can see the agenda here. The main thing that I've got today is a tutorial that I put together. I'm going to actually turn into a podcast as well, and I'm calling it the psychology of existential threats, and it kind of has to do with climate anxiety and political anxiety. And I'm a little bit of a student of psychology, just as a on my own, and there's some books I've read that I think that'll help, and so we'll go into that. But all right, let's go ahead and get started with some of the upcoming events. Drive Clean Colorado is having their, I think it's twice a year summit, and it's actually a 2 day event. They've got a what they're calling a Drive Clean Expo on February 26th, and I'll be there. New Day and a few other hydrogen things are going to be there as well. So you may want to at least take a look at that to see about coming, and you can register there at drivecleancolorado.org. And then the second day is you can see it says a ride and drive. So that's a little bit more of an outdoor, kind of hands on type of event. There's a picture there from last year. It was at the Jefferson County building, the so-called Taj Mahal, and there was even a street sweeper, hydrogen-powered street sweeper. Or I'm sorry, that one was actually battery, but it does exist a hydrogen-powered street sweeper there. So encourage you to check that out. Then the other event that's coming up in March is put on by the Colorado Clean Tech. You can see their logo there on the bottom graphic. And there isn't an agenda or anything out on that yet, but watch for that. That may be something you want to participate in, at least part of that. So encourage you all to take a look at that. Then something that I've talked about for several months running now is this upcoming so-called Helium and Hydrogen Conference put on by the Rocky Mountain Association of Geologists. And that's going to be here in Denver, so none of us have to travel, or those at least in the Front Range, for that event. And for some of the rest of you in other parts of Colorado, it's not too far. You don't have to fly at least, but that'll be April 9th and 10th. It's going to consist of a number of different lectures and an exhibit hall. CHN will be there. We plan to have a booth, and I haven't heard back, but I understand I'm going to be doing a poster session as well. So again, presented by the Rocky Mountain Association of Geologists, and you can get more information at their website, rmag.org. All right. And one of the reasons I think this is really important is that at least my analysis shows that hydrogen from geology, whether it's natural hydrogen or hydrogen pulled from old oil wells using either a chemical means of extracting the hydrogen or biology, which I just did a podcast on, is probably going to be the lowest cost source of hydrogen. So we hear a lot about electrolysis these days and so forth, but I really think geological hydrogen is going to be the dominant energy source, bar none, even more so than wind and solar. Maybe not more so than geothermal, but it's certainly going to be up there, and that's not recognized yet. So encourage you all to kind of keep tabs on geologic hydrogen. Some other events coming up. This one, top one, is down in Houston. That's June 25th and 26th. So a little bit more travel expense and so forth to go to that. But that's a pretty big expo, Hydrogen Technology Expo North America. And then they've got an international one. So if any of you are hankering for an international trip in October in Hamburg, there's another event going on that you can check out as well. So a lot going on. So something new that just came up is the Energy Gang podcast is back, but it's in a new form. They're calling it the Open Circuit Podcast. They just aired their first episode Friday, I think it was. And this is Stephen Lacey, Jigger Shaw. Jigger was the Loan Program Office Director for the last 4 years, and Catherine Hamilton. And I really enjoyed listening to the Energy Gang podcast. They always had a lot to say. Very, very, very knowledgeable people, some of the best in the industry. And They do a lot to kind of really underscore what's going on, and not only in the technical side, but business, finance, media, and so forth. Always have something good to say. So I encourage you all to check out this brand new podcast called Open Circuit. All right. So I'm going to give what I guess I'm calling it a little bit of a tutorial here, and under the title of The Psychology of Existential Threats. I know some of you may be feeling the angst that I am about the political situation, and I'm wondering what that's going to do to the climate change work. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the psychology and so forth. So, this current situation with the warming planet, the toxic political climate, all seems to present challenges that are so huge and complicated and intractable that they kind of defy our attempts to solve them. Consequently, I think a lot of people are feeling burned out and may just completely even disengage. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm bumping my keyboard here. Um, and so what I'd like to do is look at some of the psychological reasons behind the burnout and offer some solutions on how to cope. We're going to look at how the human mind works. I think it's really interesting and not really well known. And really talk about how this disconnect between our non conscious and conscious or rational minds can lead to a lot of confusion and stress. And we're going to offer some techniques for overcoming worry as well, and techniques to cultivate what I'm calling good mental hygiene, a little bit more than just disengaging and kind of checking on things. So, um, like I said, I'm a bit of a student of psychology. There's a lot of books that I've read, and these three I think are really important. This Strangers to Ourselves, which really describes this divide between the non conscious and the conscious mind, and really how that affects our thinking. I think this is probably one of the most important books you can read. I would encourage all of you to pick that up and read at least the first few chapters on that, because I think it really can give you a lot of insight into how the human mind works, yours and others. And then the End of Worry is just a very brief little how-to book to really understand what worry is and to train our imagination away from really dwelling on imagined threats, which is so easy to do these days. And then the last, which really started this whole idea of mine to do this today, is called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And this will help us all deal with these existential threats and identify some meaningful actions that can give us all a sense of realistic purpose kind of in this brave new world. So there's a lot of contributing factors right now that are just kind of giving us a perfect storm of angst and other things going on. I mean, one is that the news media really only emphasizes the negative, which tends to give us all kind of a skewed sense of what the risks are and maybe what the progress is to solving some of the issues. The adage in the news media, if it bleeds, it leads, kind of indicates that they want stories with some shock value because that catches people's attention. And basically, good news doesn't make the news usually. So, another thing is the nature of the human brain, and you're going to learn a little bit about that today. There's this big divide, believe it or not, between our non conscious and our conscious minds, which leads people to do some kind of crazy things sometimes, seems to defy logic and other things. And so, we'll talk about what that's all about. And then we'll also talk about what worry is. It's really kind of a misuse of your imagination and just letting your imagination run wild. And we'll talk about a few techniques to overcome that too. And then the last, and this I think hits a lot of young people today and those of us in the clean energy field as well, is feeling like our individual efforts are just so insignificant that they're almost not worth doing. So, as I said, the book about the Field Guide to Climate Anxiety is really set this off. And in that book, they talk about how teachers now ask students to calculate their environmental impact resulting from their consumer lifestyles. You probably heard that, your carbon footprint. And it causes young people to really go into a tailspin of guilt, just learning how much their average lives cost the earth. And the idea is you want to motivate people to do things, but basically the students feel such an overwhelming sense of guilt about their role in spurring climate change and other problems. And, they start to go so far as to thinking they need to just erase themselves and their bodies as a way of having no impact and to be more acceptable ethically to the planet. And, students, a lot of them fall into depression. So this has been called eco-nihilism, where kind of the feeling that life is meaningless, and which really causes students not to show up for class, or they go into depression where they aren't even leaving their rooms. We hear a lot about young people's mental health crisis, hear a lot of suicides, but really not very many people are saying, well, gosh, maybe this has something to do with the climate crisis. Maybe it's got something to do with the feeling of huge amounts of uncertainty that we face in our lives. And it makes it hard for these students to even imagine the future. When students are asked to imagine a world where their hopes and dreams come true, they can't even visualize the future. They don't have any imagination for what could possibly be. Everything that comes up in their minds is dystopic. So we're confronting a psychological problem, and those effects really go beyond climate change. These emotions triggered in us by these wicked problems can themselves become an impediment to solving these challenges. So when I heard that, it reminded me of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so that's one model to describe basically this inability to focus on some higher goal when your basic needs aren't being met. And Abraham Maslow's hierarchy is really based on the idea that certain human basic needs must be met first before individuals can progress up the hierarchy to more complex needs. And things like physiological needs, food, air, water. If you can't breathe, or you don't have any water to drink or food to eat, it's pretty tough to think of anything else. And then beyond that, if those needs are satisfied, that's followed by safety, and then belongingness and love and esteem, and lastly, self-actualization, which is basically to be all that you can be. So the bottom line is we need to really consider the role of emotions in thinking about the environment. Emotions are the most important thing that dictate all decision making. So when it comes to confronting climate change, we need to talk about the feelings that climate change evokes in us, because those feelings can determine whether we do something about it or do nothing about it. Despair is taking students and many of us completely out of commission for the work that we want people to do in the world, work that we're going to find purpose in and that we might even find happiness in doing. So various social activists have also experienced this feeling when facing these problems that are so big and they feel so small, and they try to solve these feelings of inefficacy by just working really, really hard. But for most people, if you approach this like a sprint rather than a marathon, you're going to burn out. So we will burn out ourselves trying to undo all the harm that we're doing to the planet. And it's not just misanthropy here, which is a dislike of humankind, but it's can also amount to a real self-loathing too, which really doesn't help us sustain the kind of stamina that's required to continue in this work. So some students take the attitude that I'm not entitled to rest, I'm not entitled to pleasure, which leads them to think, well, whatever it is that I'm doing right now, even if it's for the cause or for something I care about, it's not sufficient. So they start to ask themselves, what's the point of sitting in a classroom? What's the point in getting a degree? The world's on fire. What am I doing studying for this exam? And really, this causes a state of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is, you can see it here, it's a psychological state of discomfort that occurs when a person's beliefs or values or actions are in conflict. And people deal with this in different ways depending on the circumstances. They may use defense mechanisms like avoidance. They might try to justify or rationalize their actions. They may ignore conflicting information, and they may even change their attitudes or behaviors to reduce their discomfort. Maybe deciding, well, it's not important, so I'm not going to do it, rather than just feeling like it's too small of a thing to be bothering to do. So anyway, uh, the thing is, we really have to realize that we're getting so much media now from all corners of the globe, and it's really an overwhelming fire hose of bad news. There's a built-in negativity bias of the media. If it bleeds, it leads, like I said earlier, which has gotten worse over the last 20 years. Positive events are really not that likely to be covered in the media since good news attracts fewer viewers and doesn't have the shock value. So I know that I have tended to tune out on the news about politics because I just find it so disgusting and upsetting that uh, I just don't want to get wound up, and so that's how I'm dealing with it. But probably a better way is to maybe decide what media you're going to look at and be very careful about what you look at. So, it can happen that heavy news watchers can become
It's
miscalibrated.
mommy, so we have to wait for mommy.
Oh, Brendan, can you go on mute there? Yep. All right. So, some uh, more realistic ways to examine some of the stories we encounter. We need to look for the majority and not just the extreme poles represented in the media. Expect the media to deliver bad news and forage your defenses accordingly for that. Uh, Learn to really dig into the data a little bit, the graphs and the data. Uh, Calculate risks according to the data, not just the fears. Put things in proportion, question your categories, and avoid generalizing or stereotyping. And also getting back to this idea that maybe we can only do a little, but we should still do it. Acknowledge that slow change is still change and watch for examples of areas where there's success and change is happening. I know the podcast I was just talking about. They did that. They talked a lot about some of the good things that are starting to happen, and that was I really appreciate that in the podcast. Um, Resist pointing fingers and playing the blame game, and I think understanding a little bit about how the psychology works is going to help you with that. And take things slowly. We will get frustrated and burned out if we think we're going to reverse climate change in just a day. So, in the past, and this is what Al Gore did with his movie The Inconvenient Truth and so on, is he was trying to convince people that um, climate change was real and we need to act. So educators have continued to give focus on more and more information with the thought that if people know all the ways that climate change is going to cause disasters for everybody's lives, that maybe they'll be motivated to do something about it, the so-called scare to care technique. But people are already pretty scared. And I think, like I say, the focus needs to change. We're already feeling really overwhelmed and powerless, but what's happening here is now we're not just telling people that the problem is big, um, but they're reminded every step of the way that the problem is just too big for them, that they can't do anything about it. So basically, we're telling them it's a terrible problem and you're helpless to solve it. But the negative feeling of not being able to solve a whole problem outweighs any positive feeling of being able to solve just a small part of it. So we perceive ourselves to be powerless, so there's no point in ever even trying. So, one way to resolve this, research is starting to show that the feeling of being in a collective is a really essential part of the solution. So, if you start to see yourself in this broader collective, which really I think we're kind of doing with the Colorado Hydrogen Network, is bringing us all into a network, because then we can understand that a collective has the effects of the sum being greater than the parts. In other words, many hands make light work, as the saying goes. So, a good analogy I heard for this is a choir. If you're in a choir singing with lots of other people, if you need to stop and catch your breath or swallow, you can take a moment out to recover because you know that the rest of the choir is carrying that song. So, this need for recovering and recuperating and making sure you're resourced so that you can keep getting up in the morning and doing the work we're trying to do is something I think a lot of people are starting to come around to. So remember that small things add up to big things. The negative feeling of not being able to solve a whole problem can outweigh the positive feeling of being able to solve just a small part of it. So we perceive ourselves to be powerless, so there's no point in ever doing it. So we have to realize that our motivation for our work shouldn't be based on knowing our actions are going to make the difference we want to see in the world, because that'll give us permission to do things that are small, not because we think that they'll add up to anything big, but because they themselves inherently are adding something positive into the world, and that's a good enough reason to do it. There was a writer and a clergyman named Sidney Smith back in the 1800s who said, "It's the greatest of all mistakes to do nothing because you can only do a little." So, to recap the climate anxiety, we need to consider the role of emotions in thinking about the environment. We need to stop using the scare to care technique and instead emphasize success. Media is addictive and it's got a negativity bias. So, balance how much and which media you can consume. And maybe that's none. I don't know. These days there's so much bad news, it's hard to avoid it. And then also think of yourself as part of a collective, which can give you the space to catch your breath. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and let's delve into some pretty deep psychology here and talk about how the human mind works. So, um, our minds really are not one unified thinking machine, but really are divided into two parts: the non-conscious mind and the conscious or reasoning mind. Think of gut feelings or intuitions as part of the non-conscious. But there's something really remarkable about this structure, and that is that there is not a direct connection between the two. We literally have to observe our non-conscious mind with our rational mind to try to understand what it's doing. So psychologists tend to ask people how their cognitive processes work, and they find that people are kind of at a loss to verbalize much of what's going on in the cognitive process. And the more researchers studied these mental processes, the clearer it became that people were not aware of how they occur. Most of the mental processes studied by cognitive and social psychologists
That's very cool.
turn out to occur out of view of the people who have them. Some researchers have even gone so far as to suggest that the unconscious mind does virtually all the work and the conscious will may be an illusion. So, not that the unconscious mind is a single entity with a mind and a will of its own, but rather humans possess a collection of modules that have evolved over time and they really operate outside of consciousness. And these are things like basic processes of perception, memory, language comprehension, judgments, feelings, and motives. So, consciousness is a limited capacity system. And to survive in the world, people must be able to process a great deal more information outside of awareness. So, the mind is a well evolved system that's able to accomplish a great deal in parallel by analyzing and thinking about the world outside of awareness while consciously thinking about something else. So these lower order mental processes are things like divided attention. People can consciously attend to one thing while non-consciously processing another. Selective attention. Maybe think of the example of you can drive a car and carry on a conversation and maybe even fiddle with the heater all at the same time. So it's kind of a multitasking situation. There's automaticity of thought. So thinking can become so habitual as to occur outside of awareness with no conscious attention. Again, I'll use the example of driving. I think all of us have had the experience where we've driven several miles and don't remember a thing about it, but we did it successfully. Um, Implications of non-conscious processing for prejudice. One of the most interesting properties of the non-conscious is that it uses stereotypes to categorize and evaluate other people. And of course, this has negative consequences as well. And then lack of awareness of one's own feelings. A controversial claim about the non-conscious is that it can produce feelings and preferences of which people are not aware. So, some important tasks that we usually ascribe to consciousness can be performed non-consciously, such as deciding what information to pay attention to, interpreting and evaluating that information, learning new things, and setting goals for ourselves. Similarly, when meeting someone for the first time, we quickly make assumptions about the kind of person they are and experience either a positive or a negative evaluation, all within seconds or less. And that's done by the non conscious. So, an important part of personality is the ability to respond in quick, habitual ways to the social world. And this is not to say that the non conscious thinking always leads to accurate judgments, but on balance, it's vital to our survival. So, there are some estimates that people can consciously process about 40 pieces of information per second, but we actually take in about 11 million pieces of information a second. So, if we can only process 40 with our conscious mind, We need to make a great deal of use of this information outside of conscious awareness. Now, we're capable of learning a great deal of complex information implicitly, without any effort at all. And implicit learning is defined as learning without effort or awareness of exactly what has been learned. And one of the best examples of that is a child's ability to master their native language. Children don't spend hours studying vocabulary or attending classes on grammar and syntax. Humans learn to speak with no effort or intention. It just happens. And implicit learning is one of the most important functions of the non-conscious. And I'll add another one is if you're learning to do maybe a sport like golf or skiing or something, your non-conscious mind is really learning and programming all along, and you're not really using your conscious mind to tell it how to do that to most extent. So it's clear that the non-conscious is capable of learning complex information, and in some circumstances, it learns the information better and faster than our conscious minds. But how does the non-conscious decide what to select, how to interpret and evaluate, and what goal to set in motion? In short, what's its agenda? Clearly, non-conscious processes have to be concerned with making accurate assessments of the world. So our conscious mind is often too slow to figure out what's the best course of action. So our non-conscious mind does a job for us and signals us, in other words, gives us gut feelings that kind of tell us what to do. But you have to be observant of that. The more relevant a piece of information is, the more likely it'll be on the non-conscious filter's A list of information to notice. But self-relevance isn't quite the right way to describe how the non-conscious decides what's important and what's not. Rather, the decision rule is how accessible a particular idea or category is. Now, accessibility is actually a technical psychological term that refers to the to the activation potential of information in memory. So, accessibility is determined not only by the self-relevance of a category, but also how recently it's been encountered. Another determinant of accessibility is how often the concept has been used in the past. The more something's been used in a particular way of judging the world in the past, the more energized that concept will be. So certain ideas and categories become chronically accessible as a result of frequent use in the past. Now, the non-conscious is not governed by accuracy and sorry. The non-conscious is not governed by accuracy and accessibility alone. People's judgments and interpretations are often guided by quite a different concern, namely the desire to view the world in a way that gives them the most pleasure, or what could be called the feel-good criteria. And people go to great lengths to view the world in a way that maintains a sense of well-being. Now, really, we're masterly spin doctors and rationalizers and justifiers of threatening information. And this adaptation is actually called the psychological immune system. Some of you may have heard that before. So we possess a pretty potent psychological immune system that protects us from threats to our psychological well-being. So when it comes to maintaining a sense of well-being, each of us is the ultimate spin doctor. So a key question concerns how the accuracy and feel-good criteria operate together, because they're often incompatible. So the conflict between the need to be accurate and the desire to feel good about ourselves is one of the major battlegrounds of the self. And how this battle is waged and how it's won are central determinants of who we are and how we feel about ourselves. Now, of course, we've got to keep in touch with reality and know our own abilities well enough to engage in self-improvement. But it turns out that a dose of self-deception can be helpful as well, enabling us to maintain a positive view of ourselves and an optimistic view of the future. So the non-conscious is actively involved in learning, selection, interpretation, evaluation, and goal setting. But it's not always to people's advantage to see the world accurately. A little dose of self-deception can be useful as well. Now, just because a trait or a process has evolved due to natural selection doesn't mean it's a perfect system that can't be improved. So the advantage is conferred by many types of non-conscious mental processes, like the ability to categorize objects and people quickly, or by filling in the blanks when we encounter incomplete information. Can also have negative consequences, like the tendency to overcategorize people, leading to stereotyping and prejudice. So, the job of the non-conscious is to detect patterns in the environment as quickly as possible and to signal the person whether they're good or bad. Now, such a system has obvious advantages, but it also comes with a cost. The quicker the analysis, the more error prone it's likely to be. So, it would be advantageous to have another slower system that can provide a more detailed analysis of the environment, catching errors made by the initial quick analysis. And this is the job of conscious processing. But unfortunately, people don't always engage that check. Now, because the non conscious analysis is fast, it's fairly crude and will sometimes make mistakes. So you could illustrate this with a walk in the woods. You may see something on the ground that's linear, and your non conscious may first raise the alarm that it could be a snake, but then your rational mind takes over and realizes that this so called snake isn't moving, it's the wrong color for any snake, and so on. Now, another disadvantage of a system that processes information quickly and efficiently is that it's slow to respond to new contradictory information. In fact, we often unconsciously bend new information to fit our preconceptions, making it next to impossible to realize that our preconceptions are wrong. This is a form of confirmation bias. So, a smart, flexible system would recognize that the previously learned correlation from a very small sample does not generalize to the larger sample. Unfortunately, once a correlation is learned, the non conscious system tends to see it where it doesn't exist, thereby becoming more convinced that the correlation is true. So, this can cause people to unknowingly behave in ways that make their expectations come true, kind of a self fulfilling prophecy. So, it's fair to say that the tendency for the non conscious to jump to conclusions and fail to change its mind in the face of contrary evidence is responsible for some of society's most troubling problems, like the pervasiveness of racial prejudice. The advantages of quick appraisals and categorizations often have unfortunate byproducts. Well, I'm sure that all of us want to be in as close communication with our non conscious mind as we can. Let's all strive to be far more aware of what our unconscious mind is doing. Excuse me, is doing. Pardon me. So, to do that, I'm going to ask you all to start paying attention to your hunches and your intuition. For example, the next time you're about to leave the house and you have the feeling you've forgotten something, you probably have, and your non conscious is trying to signal you. The next time you have a gut feel about something, really explore it. That's your non conscious mind trying to signal you and tell you something. Another way that I find that I try to get in touch with what my non conscious is doing is pay attention while you're driving to what's happening, since frankly, your non conscious is probably doing most of the driving and the decision making. Things like how much to slow down for a curve, when to start braking or coming to a stop are all products of the non conscious. So I play a little game when I'm exiting the freeway. I like to observe when my non conscious mind decides to let off the accelerator. And what I do is I try to just feel when it's right and keep my conscious mind out of it. No calculations involved. All right. So, kind of a long winded explanation there, but let's kind of summarize the differences between the non conscious and the conscious mind. So, the non conscious has many, many systems, multiple systems, whereas the conscious mind is really a single system. The non conscious is a great online pattern detector. The conscious mind is really better as an after the fact check and balancer. The non conscious is concerned with the here and now, and the conscious is more a planner and taking the long view. The non conscious is automatic, it's fast, it's unintentional, it's uncontrollable, and it's effortless. Whereas the conscious mind is more controlled, it's slower, it's intentional, it's much more controllable, but it is more effortful. The non conscious mind is pretty rigid, the conscious is flexible. The non conscious is precocious, meaning it starts at a very early age without having to really be trained. But the conscious mind is slower to develop, and obviously, in some people, more developed than in others. The non conscious is a multitasker, where I think is where people get this almost mistaken impression about they can multitask. Well, your non conscious can, but your conscious mind can't. It's really a single tasker. And your non conscious mind is very sensitive to negative information. That had a survival advantage in humans. And your conscious mind is a little bit more sensitive to positive information. All right. So on the home stretch here, let's talk a little bit about this little kind of a self-help book called The End of Worry. Um, when I was a kid, my parents always called me Worry Ward, and so I decided to look into that a little bit, and I found this book really kind of interesting and helpful. So, um, actually, before I move on to the core human fears, let me just talk about this a little bit. So, really what worry is kind of a misuse of your imagination. And if you have a really good imagination, sometimes you can really be a good worrier. So, but what worry is really allowing our imagination to just run wild in a feedback loop over all of the possible bad outcomes. Now, there's a big difference between sensible planning for a possible downside versus imagining a bad outcome over and over again without really incurring any benefit from that. The former is really being prudent, and the last is just worrying. So, worrying's a habit of thought, and like most habits, it's triggered unconsciously and often operates beyond the reach of reason. So again, here's why we need to understand that we've got this non-conscious and this conscious mind in our heads, and really how they work and how they kind of fail to work together. But what we need to do is we need to take these worry habits from the clutches of the unconscious and deliver it up to the light of consciousness. And really, this is the most important step. Identifying the worry kind of robs the worry habit of its automaticity, its wildness, if you will. So if it's captured in consciousness, it's more subject to corrective steps. So I find that just sometimes knowing that you're repeating this half conscious pattern of allowing your imagination to produce endless scenarios of doom is really, that might alone might be enough to break the cycle. But if you've got some really ingrained worries, some of the exercises in this book, which are very short and very easy to do, may be needed. So the first step that this book talks about is identifying the real fear. And fear is rarely the imagined outcome or consequence of what you're worried about. It's usually deeper and more fundamental, getting down to the core human fears. And so the five core human fears are the fear of extinction, of annihilation, of ceasing to exist, of dying, basically. Mutilation, the fear of losing part of our body. The loss of autonomy, the fear of being immobilized, paralyzed, restricted, imprisoned, or smothered. And they say this comes from when you're a child, you realize that you're totally dependent on others. And so you can kind of continue living with this fear of losing your autonomy and not being able to take care of yourself. Separation, the fear of abandonment, rejection, or not being valued by anyone else. And ego death, the fear of humiliation, shame, or other mechanism of profound self disapproval. So, if we look at a couple little examples, so say we're afraid of a financial crash. Well, this really has the fundamental roots in the fear of being helpless. And the fear of an autocratic government probably has its roots in the loss of autonomy and the fear of being helpless. So, your unconscious defense mechanisms, which are designed to shield you from fearsome things, will do their best to really hide the true fear from you. And so you'll need to exercise a little bit of brutal honesty to confront it. Almost invariably, the first fear you think of in connection with an identified worry is just a screen. It's not the real fear, but rather something less scary, less central to your core, kind of shielding you from the real fear. So the next step is to plan for the downside. And that is once you've kind of identified the fear, to deal with it a little bit, set out a set of actionable sequence of behaviors that you can engage in event that the downside actually occurs. Now, planning the downside is not a happy activity, especially if we're worried about things like losing our health or losing our finances or death and things like that. But it's important to really think about those and how you'll deal with those. Now, most worrywarts never get to this step on their own. They just kind of deal with and fret with their worries day and night without so much of an inkling as how they might deal with the negative imaginings. But not having a plan makes the situation worse. It magnifies a sense of helplessness and incapacity. So once you have a detailed and actionable plan for the imagined downside, take stock of it. Realize that if things were to go wrong, you now know what to do. So, to overcome ingrained worry habits, the worry book has, like I said, a number of exercises to practice, and these are based on principles of neuroplasticity and neurolinguistic programming, or NLP. And I really encourage you to pick up this book, take a look at it. You might find it helpful, and it's very short. You can go through it in just a very short amount of time. All right, so let's summarize kind of everything that we've talked about here to kind of close this tutorial. So, we really need to start thinking of the role of emotions when we're communicating with people about the environment. We need to probably stop using the scare to care strategy and instead start looking for and emphasizing successes. And I think this speaks to what we should do with ourselves as well as with other people. Find those climate success stories, and I'll try to do some of that with the meetings that we have, with the newsletter, with the podcast to bring those out. Realize, and we've said this 5 times now, media can be addictive, and its negativity bias is destructive to mental health. So, watch what you listen to and what you expose yourself to. And then consider yourself as part of a collective, which gives you the space to take a breath and give yourself a little bit of room and rest to carry on. So, for political angst, obviously the media has a negativity bias. Um, the best bet there may be to avoid it entirely if you can, but sometimes that's not always possible. And then, now that we understand a little bit about the subconscious and the conscious, understand that people can and do hold opinions that are and seem contrary to reason and facts. And those people may be functioning mainly with their non-conscious mind, which can be easily fooled and has motivations other than facts and reason. Things such as saving face or bigotry or confirmation bias may be at work. Unfortunately, this is a very huge drawback to human nature, but it's reality we're dealing with. And then, with overcoming worry, understand that your non-conscious is basically evolved to be tuned into negative information, to bring those to your attention, to motivate you to do something about them. And worry is really a habit, and it's a misuse of the imagination. And it's triggered by the unconscious. And so we need to break the cycle by engaging the conscious mind there. And again, the worry book has some things that can help you there. So that concludes that somewhat long-winded, but I thought very useful um, tutorial on psychology. So maybe I'll pause here for a second. I know that it's probably generated a lot of thoughts in everybody's minds, but if anybody's got some, kind of concrete thoughts or questions or something they want to share, let me just pause for a second and give my voice a little rest here.
How do you put your hand up?
Yeah, Frank, you came off mute. Are you there?
Yeah, I did. Hi, Brian. So, two things. Number one, thank you for that. And I have been involved with a few meetings where I think everyone has taken a bit of a pause to kind of reflect. And so I thank you for taking the time to reflect, and very, very, very helpful. The other side thing is that we normally pay $500 an hour for that in New York. So I just want you to know that I think it was invaluable that you did that. So I want to just thank you.
Well, thanks, Frank. When I started reading some of this information, I thought, wow, these are real gems, and I don't want to keep it to myself. I want to get it out there and share it. Anybody else? Any comments or questions? And we'll probably have some. Oh, Elliot, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. I think that, it was very appropriate timing for you bringing this up. There's a lot of concern across the globe, basically, and on a lot of different things, and us particularly that are involved in environmental issues and concerns, and also all the political things. Is There's a lot of uncertainty. So, I think it's very appropriate, and I think that what we can do as a group, as you mentioned, is we can come together and find common ground to stand together, to work together, to find solutions because there's always a solution. We just have to work through and find it. And there's a lot of bright minds on this broadcast, and there have been, and I think that we can overcome that. That's how we were designed by our maker. And I think that, I've had some real down times. In fact, Brian, you're even aware of some of them. So, you know, it's okay though. It's okay to have that, but it's also okay to recognize and regroup and go through a process and work through it and look for solutions. And we have a lot of really amazing things that can happen in this world, in spite of what other people say or do. And I really believe that. And it's good to be around good, caring people that aren't in it for their own self-interests from that perspective. We all have common ground. We all have needs. We all have wants. We have those things that we need to take care of. But then again, we all have a common purpose, and that's to make this world a little bit better place than when we got here. And I think that you bring that out, and I encourage all of us to remember that. And when we do have challenges and stuff, to reach out to one another and just talk about it.
Yeah. Well, that was the theme, I guess I'll say, of this new open circuit podcast today. There was not, there was a little bit of talk about some of the negative that's going on with the presidential administration right now, but in general, the mood was very upbeat, saying, you know what, there's a lot of good climate stuff that's happening. Clean energy is now cheaper um, than the petroleum and the fossil fuels are. And it's gonna keep moving. And so I encourage you all to check out that podcast. I just think Stephen Lacey, Jigger Shaw, and Catherine Hamilton are just amazing. What they know and the way they're able to convey it. And I think that plus us being aware of what's going on, of how we can deal with it, and what some of the tools are to help us can give us hope. Otherwise, you lose hope, you've lost everything.
One last thing, real quick, is that I really believe that that there's shining lights even in the darkest hours, and I posted it up on the chat here, but Michael Bloomberg stepped up and is funding America's part of the Paris Climate Accord personally, annually, 700 and some $1 million a year. That's just one guy. How many people like that are out there? Well, they're shining lights. Each one of them, each one of us is a shining light. We go forward with what we know is right and just, no matter what, and um, things will get better. And the one thing I would say aside from the direct, barbs of political involvement, one thing is a lot of regulatory stuff is going to be pushed out of the way. So maybe getting some stuff when we can get to that place, getting stuff permitted can get moved through a lot quicker. So maybe that's a hope that we can look at. So
We'll keep looking for those silver linings.
absolutely. And you pile them in, and you got a piece of gold, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There you go. Hi, friends.
All
Hey,
right. Other comments or questions? These are great. Thanks, Elliot, and thank you, Frank.
I'm happy to give my comments, Brian. Thanks for doing that. That was good timed, and I think we all go through that if you work on the energy transition. But when we started CHN, we did have Trump in charge, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And what a lot of what we were doing is saying, hey, there's a lot of activity in the US on a state level, but everything is dead at the federal level.
Mhm.
But didn't stop us from doing what we did, right? So what you saw is other parts in the world there was less disruption because of these political cycles. China has been just going steady and has been very successful with being the key provider of components and technology for the energy transition. Europe, more difficult, but there was way more going on in Europe in the first Trump period than in the US. And then a couple of years later, Europe was complaining that there was so much money put on the market at the federal level in the US that all the good projects would go to the US. And now we see another swing, right? So I bet 3, 4 years from now, the picture look quite different. But technology development doesn't take, it takes longer and more consistency. So I think we should just keep doing the right things, indeed focus on the good things. I really think it is good to also show what's going on in the rest of the world too. Maybe if we find interesting articles and podcasts and stuff. Because our world, we see a lot of US news, but the world is way bigger. There's a lot more going on. So I think to show what's going on, focus more maybe on what can be done at the state and what's going on outside of the US, and see what kind of key projects keep going based on the funding that was provided, because it's not that easy to stop everything. And the other thing I want to add is, because I'm always with a half foot in Europe, I talk to a lot of people in Europe and I always have to defend what's going on in the US, right? So when the US stepped out of the Tokyo Treaty, that was in 2001 or so, was it George W? The targets were set for 2005 of reducing CO2. And that is somewhat later. But I think the US was one of the few that met it without being part of it. And the key thing is, and that happened during the period of the first Trump administration, that energy decisions are not 4-year decisions. They're 25-year decisions. And when the EPA was suddenly, the rulings of the EPA were no guideline for the power industry, CEOs had to make 25-year decisions. They were not guided by what the EPA was saying. They basically had to say, I have customers and I have shareholders, and I have to satisfy them on a 25-year basis. So it accelerated some clean energy decisions, independent of what the EPA, what part of global alliances we're part of. So I think you also have to look through, and I think some of that accelerated because as a CEO, you couldn't just say, I'm going to do the bare minimum to follow the EPA rulings, because you'd be fired by your customers and your shareholders. So I think that it is very disturbing, but you also have to look through it and say, are the decisions made by the rulings of the government, or are they made by smart CEOs that basically want to set their companies up for the next 30 years? And they probably take different decisions. And we saw that in 2016, 2020, and I think we're going to see some of that continue to happen. Now, incentives might not be as good as we had hoped, but it doesn't mean that the decisions will not be taken.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Franz. Appreciate that. And this reminds me of that quote. I'm trying to think who it was, but there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Or it's been said another way: no army can stop an idea whose time has come. And I think that that's kind of what you're saying here. That this whole idea of clean energy, renewable energy, because it's cheaper and it makes sense. And I think there's a motivation of a lot of people too, realizing that it's the right thing to do. I know that business decisions aren't always made on that; they're made on financial reasons. But I think that there is a real push, and I think it's going to continue. And that was the tone of the podcast today as well. So again, encourage you all to check out that podcast.
Well, I want to add one more thing. So I worked for about 9 months between industry partners and the group was putting together this 4-state hydrogen hub.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked with many companies who were willing to put in hydrogen plants, right? And I was pulling these people in to say, okay, what projects can we put under our portfolio of projects to get the hub here? And so And a lot of them basically said, we don't want to have that government money. That government money comes with so many red tape
Yeah.
that we have enough money and investors that want to put the money up. So the second thing they said, you have to demonstrate proper use cases. So create demand. The industry will fund the creation of hydrogen production plants. So if you guys can help, putting trains on hydrogen, you can put cars on hydrogen, put your money there, not in participating in 50% of the investment on a hydrogen plant. Because when the demand is there, the industry has enough money to fund it themselves. So I think it was also interesting feedback that a lot of the companies just said, we look at markets, we don't look at government incentives per se. And a lot of government incentives come with a lot of red tape. So we don't need them.
Yeah. And they can go away too at the change of an
Yeah.
administration.
Yeah. So maybe to feed on your kind of, we should look at more the positive
Yeah.
because it's all in the black in what it looks like at this point.
Well, Franz, that's such a great segue to what I wanted to talk about next, which I've brought up, I don't know, two or three or four meetings now, is this idea of a clean energy hub. We've had hydrogen hubs and other kind of tech hubs and so forth, but I really feel that there is a need for an overall, here's what the energy transition looks like kind of a thing. So I've been talking to uh, Colorado Clean Tech, which used to be CCIA, Colorado Clean Tech Industries Association. They've shortened their name to just Colorado Clean Tech. And with the Energy and Sustainability Collaboratory about collaborating, combining our efforts to try to put out there an idea for a hub and getting people involved in it. Now, as it turns out, Colorado Clean Tech has, I think they've already got it or they're about to get a grant from OEDIT for a Colorado Clean Tech Coalition. And the idea here, and I've talked to this before, so this is a review, but basically come up with a plan for a clean energy market or an ecosystem that has the supply, the transport, the users, the infrastructure, funding. Solve for what? Let's get a picture of what this thing looks like, and then how do we implement it? How do we cooperate? What's the timing on doing things? Where does the funding come from? And this will help to focus efforts, guide decisions, and investment. So I would like to see this plan put together, and then we'll go out and we'll enlist basically a number of stakeholder participants, companies, individuals, universities for sure, the labs, to help really vet the plan. Is it a good plan? Does it need to be changed? How does it change over time? And then also these stakeholders would be participants in this ecosystem. And by having this plan, it helps introduce the different stakeholders. It helps to, hey, this company over here would like to do this. This other company needs that. Let's bring them together, play matchmaker, if you will, to make those things happen. And maybe put out RFPs. This organization wouldn't have money, so these wouldn't be funded, but at least RFPs, RFIs to just get feedback from people because, you may have an idea, but other people may have even better idea about it. And then look for ways maybe to fund pieces of this, either investment or grants or other support. So what this looks like, and I've showed this several times before, is we've got sources of clean energy, and I think this is a comprehensive list. And you notice I've divided it into electrons from the electricity part of it and molecules because, as I said earlier, I think geological hydrogen is going to have a really big role in the future. And then I think biomass and algae are going to be important because those could be made directly into synthetic fuels, biofuels that do contain carbon, but the carbon comes from the atmosphere. So it's either net zero or even if you sequester some of that, you could actually make it net negative. So I think we need to really focus on users because without consumers of all this clean energy, it does us no good to produce it and transport it. Um, You'll notice that the second item down there is data center, and I included that as a specific category because it's probably going to be so huge. The others aren't a surprise: electric grid, transportation, um, maritime, agriculture, those kind of things. And then all the stuff that happens in between. The either conversion of energy from one form to another, like electricity to hydrogen or hydrogen to ammonia and so forth. The transport, we've got to have that either in some kind of vehicle like a train or a truck or a pipeline. And by the way, I really think this idea of a pipeline that can carry hydrogen has been solved with the triaxial pipe, where you've got an inside pipe that carries hydrogen. It will have a bit of permeability. It will leak a little bit of hydrogen. So then you have a second pipe around that to collect that and either recycle it or deal with it. And then the last is maybe the existing pipeline, like an existing gas pipeline that was never designed to handle hydrogen, but by lighting it with these other pipes on the inside, I don't see pipeline as an issue. So that's just my 2 cents there around that. And then storing, whether the energy gets stored as in a battery or stored as gas like hydrogen or something else or liquid hydrogen. This is the whole market. And I think we need to have a diagram like this spaghetti chart, which you've all seen before, that shows us what all the pieces are. Because if you look at this, you may say, all right, I think we've just heard there's hydrogen discovered. We can put in a well. All right. And that's going to generate an awful lot of hydrogen. We need a user for that. So what about if we ran that into a turbine, created electricity, and supplied that to a data center and did it all on site? Just one example. Now you've got a big consumer of that hydrogen from those wells, which makes them make their business case. But once that piece is up and running, now you can say, oh, that's a pretty cheap source of hydrogen. How about for a few fuel stations, we buy a little of that or whatever? And so there's a lot of interdependencies here and a lot of symbiosis. And so that's why I think it's really important that we have an overall plan, that it's a comprehensive plan, that everybody's had a chance to look at it and vet it and grow it over time or make tweaks or whatever. I think without this, we're kind of lost. And so that's why I'm calling on the Colorado Clean Tech as well as the Collaboratory to try to help get this idea out there. And if it's a good idea, I think it'll take off. So that's what I do in my spare time. All right. Well, actually, before I jump off of that, any comments or anything about this whole idea of a clean energy hub? And it's starting Colorado, but I see it as being national and even international. All right. Well, we can come back if you come up with a question or a thought later on. So I did want to mention just a little bit about membership. I've talked about this last couple meetings. Just asking you all to please consider a paid membership. We put in, not that recently, but just a few months back, we put in some new membership levels, $50 a year for individuals and $200 a year for the first 2 years of a startup. And those are both tax deductible. So, if out of the goodness of your heart, you want to help support CHN, encourage you to maybe do that. And by the way, I'm not sure if it's up and running yet. There is a place where you can just make a one-time donation too, if you'd like to do that. Now, we are going to consider, or I'm sorry, we are going to continue with the memberships that we've had, which are basically targeted toward corporations, and they're based on the size of the organization, on the number of employees. But that includes a CCIA membership, and those are a little more expensive. Obviously, most people aren't going to pay $1,000 for an individual membership. So we've got a membership that fits everybody's pocketbook, I guess I can say. And if you do help sponsor us, that'll help us to sponsor events like the Colorado Hydrogen Day. I mean, we spent thousands of dollars on that last event. The income we had from people being exhibitors didn't cover everything, but we'd like to do that again this coming year. But we're going to have to build up our coffers a little bit, or maybe find a corporate sponsor that can help with that. But I think beyond just the altruistic ways of helping support us, I think, if you throw a little money in, it may kind of give you a sense of ownership. So consider doing that. If you just go to the website, this is on the left, here's the web page. If you hover your cursor over members, the join uh, button will pop up, and you click on that, and that takes you to this page that lists what the dues are for the different levels. And if you want the individual or startup, you click on this button down here, join individual startup. If you're a corporation and you want to be a member of both CHN and CCIA, you can hit the corporate button and then the donate button. And I should have checked before this meeting to find out if that was live. That may not be live yet, but I saw a flash up. Somebody had their hand up. Do you still have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, Brian, thanks again, yeah, for the topic on the meeting tonight. That was helpful. And I was wondering along those lines at the beginning of the new year, and people have mentioned in the past that all these hubs are building up, like Denver. I'm actually in New York too, so I was going to reach out afterwards about who else might be from New York I heard before. But is there conversations happening with the sort of quote unquote leadership from each of the hubs to begin at least a conversation for planned interconnections? This way there can be goal setting. Like, part of what you mentioned, I think with the kind of like staying connected and the mentality of staying part of a community, I've been experiencing a lot of that frustration while I'm job hunting, especially. And yeah, just hoping you could touch on that for a second.
Yeah, so I have not really been communicating with the other, like the hydrogen hubs. Now, I know Bill Leedy is on, and Bill has been involved with the Pacific hub. I don't know, Bill, if you are listening, if you want to comment about how the hubs are communicating at all, if you have any
Brian,
insight.
can you hear me? Can you
Yeah,
hear
go
me?
ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I was on the advisory committee for the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub, and it was not a very transparent process. We never got to see the concept paper, nor the final full application, nor much beyond that. They did ask for new project proposals if you could supply 80% of your funding. And I submitted a concept paper for that. It was not encouraged for full application, but I may submit a full application anyway. I don't know to what extent those are communicating with each other. It's a very opaque process. There's secrecy and protection of what they perceive to be their intellectual property, I suppose. So I'm not aware that there's a lot of cooperation going on. And maybe they're about to be defunded anyway. So I haven't heard anything about that.
Right. Yeah, I don't. Can anybody else comment on any knowledge of communication between the hubs? Bill, you're absolutely right because of intellectual property. They're all sort of secretive. I found that when I tried to at least get the proposal or something from the Rocky Mountain Hub, wasn't successful there. But if anybody else has got any insight, please speak up.
Well, I've not been directly involved, but I've done quite some research about the state of the different hubs. And there's not a lot of published on it. I think a lot is going on in between the DOE and the different hubs, and the money is not fully flowing. So I do think all the hubs feel they're in competition still, because it's unclear what exactly will happen and how much money will go and where it's going. That I do think people keep their cards to the chest and say, and unless we know exactly what's going on, there might be a better opportunity for collaboration between the hubs. But what I've seen so far is that there's a lot of secrecy, and I think people are much more in competition rather than collaboration.
Yeah. And I would
First
expect,
year's funding was only 25 or so million dollars. I don't know whether those checks have been written and the funds are in the bank at the hubs, or whether that can be held back as well. But that's a pretty modest amount of money for planning only. And then the larger amount was for projects over the next 5 years.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Abe Mooney, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Oh, great. Hi. Well, first time I'm attending one of your meetings. I've been listening to your podcast for a long time. But I really like your clean energy ecosystem plan. I haven't seen that before, but it makes a lot of sense to me. There's already so many crossovers between molecules and electrons that it's great to see that all on one page. But I would just submit that CO2 should be on there as well amongst the molecules. It's obviously a big part of our energy ecosystem today, and I just think it will continue to be for a long time. And um, not just from the smokestacks, but also just industries that consume it, and then I'm also considering like derivative fuels, and I guess I see CO2 being an important molecule to play with, and I wanted to get that on your radar.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Abe. And I think CO2 is going to be with us for quite some time. And as a matter of fact, it'll never go away completely because it's used in like soft drinks and things like that, where you actually need that CO2. Um, this system, this clean energy ecosystem, really doesn't have any carbon in it other than from the biofuels and biomass. And the idea there is you keep that incorporated into the fuel for those hard to decarbonize areas like maritime or aviation that and building heating, where it just society may at some point in time decide, you know what, we're never going to be able to get rid of that because we can't come up with an aviation fuel that can take us across continents um, without using some sort of a carbon-based fuel. Maritime, I think, is already there. They're really pushing hard to use methanol and building heating. I think trying to change out every furnace in the world is just too hard. I think you may have to come up with a fuel that will work with the existing infrastructure just because either it's too costly or people won't agree to having their furnaces changed. There's always
Right.
people, no matter how good the deal is, there's people out there that won't go for it. So I think there's going to be a need for carbon in some of the fuels, and that's kind of where this was going. But I think your point is a valid one that the CO2 system, I don't know if we consider part of clean energy, but it's got to be considered out there somewhere.
Well, I mean, capture is part of that's how we make it clean is carbon capture, and I think there's a lot of environmentally minded folks that don't really want to consider that, but I just think that's so short-sighted, right? Like we're so far away from not having carbon dioxide leaving our smokestacks that it's sort of a it does need to be part of the clean energy ecosystem, in my opinion.
Well, it does, and especially initially,
Right.
because
Right.
we you don't automatically or you don't instantly, I should say, tear out all the old combustion engines and turbines and everything else and replace them with fuel cells and so forth. I mean, that doesn't happen overnight. So certainly in the interim,
Yeah.
there's got to be a need for it. So that's a good point. I'll noodle on
Okay.
how
Thank
we
you.
incorporate that into this. Yeah,
Mhm.
thanks, Abe.
Mhm.
Brian, Bill again.
Yeah.
I don't mean to complicate your diagram, but you don't include methanol. The cruise ships will not be able to use ammonia because of its poisonous characteristics. If you had a leak, you could kill a couple thousand people potentially.
Yeah.
But methanol is favored by the Green Corridor project for the Pacific Northwest
Mhm.
cruise ship industry, the 40 ships that come from Seattle and Vancouver home ports into Southeast Alaska. Of course, that requires not only clean hydrogen, but a CO2 source in order to synthesize that. So that becomes a complication.
Well,
Even if
well,
you,
wait, Bill, but not so fast, not so fast. So first of all, the biofuel here is methanol.
is
And
it? Okay.
yes,
All right.
and I don't think it makes any sense to create hydrogen and then try to grab CO2 out of the air to make methanol. I think a much better way is with biology, especially algae. Did a podcast on two podcasts on algae, talking about how they're a very, very lucrative way to do direct air capture of CO2 and turn it into the biofuels that we need because not only do they produce a biocrude, but they also produce animal feed as well as other chemicals. And so you can make a lot of money with an algae farm coming up with biofuels, and you can easily turn that biocrude into methanol. So to your point, methanol absolutely is on here for maritime and maybe for aviation. Although I think for aviation, you just go take your biocrude from your algae and make JP4 out of it, or you make natural gas out of it for building heating, or you make methanol out of it for maritime. So um, I really think that's a biggie, the biofuel, especially from algae. So we
Great,
had,
thank you.
yeah, thanks, Bill. Didn't mean to kind of jump on you there, but we're in violent agreement, I guess. So, okay, I see Jane's got her hand up. There were some other hands, but Jane, why don't you go ahead? Because I see yours up right now.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks for such a great meeting today. It's been really uplifting, and I appreciate that. So, I had a question about membership. I'm a little confused. Maybe we could go back to that slide. So, as you know, there are many startups that are in startup mode for more than 2 years. So I'm not sure if we then need to step forward into the $1,000, is that per year membership?
Well, maybe I need to rethink the 2 year limit. That's one, and then the other is this is a completely an honor system. I mean, you see this down here in red. The participation is open to everybody at no charge, and so if you're a startup and you're paying $200 the first year, and then things just aren't going well, and you want to just drop to an individual membership or stop paying completely, I'm not hard over on any of these things, but you bring up a good point about 2 years. I mean,
Yeah,
um,
well, no, I mean, let me just explain my personal situation. So, some years ago now, at this point, we paid the $1,000 fee to join, and thought for some reason, I guess I don't, it was a misunderstanding that that was all that we needed to do. And so now I'm thinking, oh, so I owe for, at least this year and potentially last year for membership. But then we're still in startup mode, and since we stepped up to the plate and did the $1,000 payment, now I'm thinking, well, I mean, obviously, as you point out, something is better than nothing, but I'm just trying to follow the rules as
yeah,
one would like to do.
right.
So
Yeah.
I'm just
Well,
not sure where I need to go with it. And technically, we don't have any real employees. So I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't know how to judge this.
yeah. Well, really, those corporate memberships include the CCIA membership, now called Colorado Clean Tech. So, if that's not even of interest, don't worry about that. But you bring up a really good point here, and that is that I have not been clear over the years that these were annual memberships. And, with the corporate, those kind of automatically got rebilled to some of the utilities and others that were buying a corporate membership. But again, Jane, it's not, this is all an honor system. And,
All right.
if it's a
So you're
really
not,
lousy year and you don't want to pay anything, that's fine.
all right.
Um, it's just that after the hydrogen day, it really pretty well depleted our coffers. And I'm thinking about, well, gosh, someday we should hire some staff. I do this free, which I'm happy to do. And so I really should pay a little bit more attention to try and encourage people to, throw a few shekels our way. But I'll reconsider that 2 year on the startup. Maybe that's too short.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, thank you for that $1,000 membership. Appreciate that.
Oh, yeah, of course. No
Yeah.
problem.
All right. So there were some other hands up, I think. Are those questions still out there? No? Okay. All right. Maybe we answered those. So the last thing was just basically a news item that came up about this whole idea of going directly from sunlight and water to hydrogen. And this has been around a long time. As a matter of fact, it was this idea of this artificial leaf that was done by Daniel Nocera at MIT back, I think I first heard about it in 2006, that got me started into the whole hydrogen space. And it's kind of an interesting concept where there's some kind of a semiconductor material that uses the light and the water to directly go to hydrogen and oxygen. So the advantage there is you don't need any electrolyzer, right? It's all kind of one stop. Supposedly, they've gotten around the issue of freezing because you think, well, okay, we got water that's on a panel sticking out in the environment. Does it freeze? Supposedly, that's been resolved. But there was this company, or is this company, Sun Hydrogen, which I want to get onto the meetings as well as maybe onto a podcast to talk about their panel. And really, I want to try to understand the business case. And I tried to look at that here. Um, According to my calculations, which I don't know how correct they are, but um, a 210 kilogram a day fuel station would need about an acre of panels. And so you think, well, the advantage to these panels is that they produce hydrogen on site, but yet the sites that need those, like a fuel station, may not have the area they need for panels. So I'm not sure. It's really a question in my mind of where these fit, where the business case is for these things. And I started thinking, well, what about for your home? Okay, what about a car driven the average mileage a person drives and the mileage of a hydrogen car? You probably need about half a kilogram a day or about a 12 by 12-foot area of panels. So, yeah, you could have that at home, but it can get a little expensive for the nozzle and dispensers and other things, maybe some tanks to store it. Um, but anyway, it's an interesting thought. And so I'm going to pursue this a little bit more, but I just wanted to kind of throw this out as kind of food for thought on this. All right, the last thing I have, and then we've got a few more minutes left, so we could take some more questions if there are any. It's just an update on the podcast. I've been pretty lax lately at putting out new podcasts, but I'm going to do the psychology that we talked about today, and you can see some of those previous ones. And I continue to get inquiries from people around the world. As a matter of fact, a guy from Ghana, which I think I'm going to put, it's in Africa, about where the 4 in the 284 is right here. Probably do a podcast with him. But anyway, any other questions, comments, concerns, anything else anybody wants to bring up in the last few minutes we've got here? Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking on your membership thing, maybe you could look at it about companies that are in the startup mode that are pre-revenue,
Yeah.
as an opportunity to scale that.
That's a good idea, Elliot. Rather than giving it a time limit, say, yeah, maybe I have to specify a little more carefully, but I'll give that some thought. Yeah, that's a great point. Very good. Thank you. All right, anybody else? Or is everybody hungry and they want to get to dinner? Or Miller time, huh? So,
Yes, I had a funny question maybe to put out there really fast just to mention, maybe food for thought for another meeting down the road or for people, because I know it's last minute now. But with everything else you mentioned with the news too, is electric vehicles don't have the best press these days, I'll just say. And isn't it such an opportunity for hydrogen vehicles if they were going to supposedly or potentially ever leapfrog electric vehicles? Is there any push, or I know there's these massive undertakings that massive companies want to take, but at the same time, if it's ever been ripe for disruption, I mean, I have my own daydreams sometimes about reinventing, another hydrogen vehicle design that has its own hybrid features, so to speak, but maybe a bit of retro and a bit futuristic at the same time. But I'm just curious if anybody's ever noticed that, or maybe I'm just not up on the beat and I got to get my finger on the pulse with that auto industry better.
well, that's a really good point, Ross. And I think there's no question that if we had some hydrogen stations out there, hydrogen vehicles would be taken off like gangbusters. But we don't have any stations. And so that's kind of the first step, is to try to get that out there. Now, as you may know, Honda came out with their CRV, which is a plug-in hybrid fuel cell vehicle. And I think that is the transportation of the future. Day to day, you can charge at home and just run on the battery. And then if you want to take that long trip to New York to visit Ross, you can engage the fuel cell and get the longer range. Um, but we've just got to get them out there. And in the meantime, battery vehicles, if they'll work for people, they don't work for everybody, but If you can tolerate their limitations, or if it's a second car, at least that's cutting down on emissions, and that's really our goal in the end, after all. So, all right. Well, thanks, Ross.
Thanks.
Still got 5 minutes. Anybody else? All right. Well,
Hey,
oh, I
hey,
thought I heard one.
Franz, Franz, could you get a hold of me? I put my phone number in the chat.
Yeah, Elliot,
Hey,
you're on my call list,
well,
so
there you
I
go.
will
Thank
call
you.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I will do. Absolutely.
All right.
Brian, this was a very moving meeting. I think that it was the timing and of with everything's going on, and let's just all pause and have patience and let things, let the big picture stuff take care of itself, and we'll focus on what we do best, and that's putting together the opportunity to have a clean environment. And I think in the end we'll win.
That's right. And this is a grassroots movement of the Colorado Hydrogen Network, and we'll keep marching ahead. And the most important thing is never give up.
Yeah.
Thanks so
Winners
much,
never quit and
Brian.
quitters never win.
That's right.
Thank you,
Thanks so much,
Brian.
Brian.
Yeah,
Really
thanks,
appreciate it.
Kari.
Yeah,
All right,
thank
thank you, everybody. We'll adjourn.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Brian.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.